Welcome to Governance Bites. I'm Mark Banicevich, and today it is my absolute privilege to spend time with Dr. Peter Crowe. Peter, thank you very much for your time.
Well, it's a pleasure to come and sit with you. Thank you.
Thank you. So today, Peter actually is one of the world-renowned experts in governance. Not only does he have a PhD in governance and strategy, he is an independent chair and director on a number of boards and has a lot of governance experience, not just in New Zealand but around the world. He's also designed and delivered courses in New Zealand for the Institute of Directors and Governance New Zealand, and also around the world in places as diverse as Kenya, Lithuania, India and Ireland. An absolute expert in the field and a real privilege to spend time with you. I really appreciate your time, Peter. Thank you.
Look, it's great. Thank you.
Given Peter's diverse experience, we're going to talk a little bit about governance around the world. The first question is, given the source of New Zealand governance really has come from the UK, from the Westminster system.
Yep, that's right.
To start with, are there any significant differences or major differences between governance in the UK and governance in New Zealand?
What an interesting way to start the conversation, Mark. That's fantastic. Very similar. There's a scale difference. Obviously, the size of our New Zealand companies gets you into mid-market in the US, and the length of our history in New Zealand compared that arc of history through the UK. But generally speaking, unitary boards wanting to do the best. The Companies Act in the UK and here it would be, I don't know, 98% the same 7 duties, the same intent to both comply and ensure that we've got performance. So remarkably similar.
Right. Is there any difference in terms of the level of experience and expertise of directors in the UK versus directors in New Zealand?
Oh, look, I think there's a greater maturity sitting in the UK, but there's probably a greater enthusiasm here as younger people come through. The vestiges of power, we like holding on to things, and if we've got directors sitting in the UK that have been there for a while, as in one or two other countries around the world, we let go of power gradually if we can.
Right. Well, let's then move to the United States, the largest economy in the world.
Yep.
Initially, also with a UK background, but it's quite separate from the UK for the last 200 years, a little over 200 years, and created its own path. The 7 largest companies on the S&P 500 are massive corporations that are larger than most countries, not even many countries, but their balance sheets are larger than most countries that are on the planet. What are the differences in governance between the United States model and the UK and New Zealand model?
So there's a fundamental difference right back at the core in that the American system is effectively a rules-based system, whereas the Westminster system is much more around principles and practices. So what's the right thing to do in the UK is, does this make sense? In the US, it's follow the rules. So there's a strong compliance orientation in the US. Boards in the Commonwealth countries tend to meet monthly. Boards in the US tend to meet quarterly. Boards in the UK and other parts around the world, you'll see a separation between the chair and the chief executive, 2 different people. In the US, much greater overlap. In fact, before year 2000 and when we had WorldCom and Tyco, something like 95%, some huge percentage of all the listed firms in the US, the chair and the chief, the president, if you will, the same person. To concentration of power. So there's some marked differences and a much stronger focus on shareholder economic performance in the US as well.
That would suggest that in the US model, with the president leading the company in both the board and the day-to-day operations or the management of the company, it would almost have a feel like an advisory board situation where the owner of a business takes advice from other people, but then basically makes the decisions. I wonder how much it feels like that in a US corporation.
Elon Musk.
Yes.
For example.
Great example.
Yeah, and that's what I would put back. So, answer to your question, yes. Many of these leaders have got narcissistic tendencies. I'm not suggesting it's a bad thing, but the board is very much their board, as opposed to I'm the chief and I serve the board. It's just that subtlety. The very best boards and the very best chief executives work together really, really well.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. What if we then skip across the ditch to Australia?
Yep.
How different is it in the Australian model?
New Zealand to Australia?
New Zealand to Australia.
Difference is scale.
Again.
Telstra, BHP, larger corporations, but fundamentally scale. There's a little bit more maturity in the listing code with the ASX. For example, here there's no requirement in terms of the maximum number of boards that you can serve on concurrently. In Australia, they've realised that that serving on a board and that craft of board work, if you will, is demanding. So 1 week per board per month, and in fact ASX says no more than 4 concurrent substantive board appointments, and if you're the chair, then that counts 2, for example. Right. And we don't have that here. So some directors, and there are outliers that are fantastic directors, fantastic chairs, but once you get past about 3 or 4 boards, your effectiveness can become compromised. So Australia's recognised that, New Zealand hasn't yet.
That would suggest that the remuneration for an Australian director must be significantly higher than, for an Australian one, must be significantly higher than for New Zealand, because if you can only do 4 boards and you want to get a good income out of it, it'd have to be a lot higher than in a country where you might sit on 6, 7, 8 boards.
Yeah, that's correct. So there's a couple of things in there though. New Zealand is known as remunerating directors relatively poorly compared with other advanced economies. Okay, so I think we can put that almost as a truism that that's the case. Okay, but the other piece is the fiduciary responsibility of directors is a responsibility around service, and you've got to do what it takes. And while you want value from the directors, it's not there as an executive income replacement. So maturity and wisdom of the directors, generally you're looking for these directors, they may well have had a successful career elsewhere, but now the coin is turning a little bit, and it's about service out. So you don't become a director in New Zealand as a full-time package if you want to get rich.
No, indeed. And is this, in areas of Australian law, when it relates to compliance and regulation, Australia is often very rules-based. You've described that as being the case in governance in the US. Yeah. Is Australian governance more principles-based or more rules-based, or a bit of a mix?
So there's the interpretation of what's written as well. The 7 duties in the UK, the same here, the same in Australia. Right? So at that fundamental level, a director here would be very comfortable and familiar directing in Australia, and particularly on a like-for-like sector or that sort of, banking here, banking in Australia, mining, whatever it is. So that's straightforward. Where it gets a little bit more compliance oriented is you've got state and federal, Australia does turn to the US a little bit in terms of some of its economic and commercial mindset. So there is perhaps a tendency for a little bit more rules-based, but fundamentally the lucky country is about principles. And I think you would find most of the time New Zealand, Australia, Canada, UK would be almost the same positioning.
Okay. You've also had a lot of experience in Africa. How is it different in places like Africa and Asia? there any differences that you see in those countries?
So there's an interesting development there, and I'm going to tip in Eastern Europe as well, if I may.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So Asia, Eastern Europe, Africa, relative to what we've talked about so far, are relatively young economies and relatively early in their development around boards and board work.
Yes.
Comparatively. Mm-hmm. Yep. And so what we see in, for example, Eastern Europe, they have looked to the Baltics, the UK, the US since the fall of communism and picked the eyes out of the others and assembled it for their context. And they're going gangbusters. They're doing outstanding. The former British, Portuguese, German, French colonies in Africa doing the same thing, but they're being even smarter because they're looking at some of the societal pressures, ESG, for example.
Yes.
In fact, when I was in Kenya late last year, no, Peter, we don't want to talk about ESG. We just want to run our business. We're there on sustainability, but we're not there on three-letter acronyms. Mm-hmm. So it's a different level of maturity, and in Asia, they just want to make money.
Okay.
And less, how do I say this politely? The political correctness around describing what we are or what we want, there seems to be a greater level of comfort of just saying it straight out. Mm-hmm. Like I've sat with Chinese heritage people who said, Peter, you're white, I'm yellow. You wouldn't get away with that in New Zealand, would you?
No.
Now, I've only experienced it twice, and I'm not saying it's common, but there are differences like that, and it's about making money. It's about economic performance. We've got the safety net of the welfare state. They don't.
Yes.
And so if I can't make money, if I can't feed my family, we've got a problem.
Absolutely.
In those, not so much Eastern Europe, but certainly in some Asian economies and definitely in Africa.
Yes, and I can imagine there'll be differences across Asia as well because it's so diverse between China, Japan, Southeast Asia,
India.
Yes, yes. So let's not get into the details too much. There, I'd love to be here all day, but I know not there's time to do that.
Yeah.
But I haven't asked you about Europe. Continental Europe, Western Europe, how is that different?
So there's some interesting things in there that we don't talk about that often. But for example, whereas in America, I mentioned the chair-in-chief being the same person through until about year 2000. It's changed with the regulatory environment that's since then. Now around about 40 or 50% of listed companies, the chair-chief, same person. Mm-hmm. 20, 25 years ago, 90, 95%.
Yes.
In Europe, two-tier boards, not unitary. So you've got a supervisory board, and that's comprised of some shareholder representation, employee union, other. And the view is that provides a more well-rounded perspective in the boardroom. Those supervisory boards meet 2 or 4 times a year, mm-hmm. And they're much high touch. Then under that, you've got what's called a management board, which, when you think about it, is not actually that dissimilar to an executive suite. But they call it a management board. So it's very much a 2-tier model, UK, Commonwealth, and the US unitary. Yes. Chief executive goes straight in. So the big difference is you basically never see a chair and the chief the same person in Europe.
Right. That was, and the shareholder employee board,
yeah.
Is that the level that has ultimate responsibility? Who then sets strategic direction, manages risk, those sorts of things? Is that split between both boards, or is that?
So in Europe, the management board, the lower board, drives the business. Right. And the upper or the supervisory board is primarily, in practice, about accountability. And so you'll see the strategy being approved in the management board, and there might be a ratification at supervisory. Now, slight differences company to company and country to country. Germany, for example, 2-tier boards are part of the landscape. Other countries, there's the option, and then yet other countries it's unitary. So there is a bit of a range in Europe, and so I'm speaking generally across the continent as opposed to within specific countries. But when there is a supervisory board, it's more around accountability and stewardship than it is around driving performance.
That was a quick whirlwind tour of the world, really.
Wasn't bad, eh?
On differences, what do you think across the globe is similar in governance?
It's probably about three things, actually.
Mm-hmm.
So first, we've got a whole range of external pressures bearing in on commerce. Geopolitics, economic turbulence, the march of technology, whether it's disruptive competitive forces or AI or some tech development. So we've got all this. So directors are struggling to keep up with those developments, even if they're reading widely and reading often. So that's the first thing. Mm-hmm. Second thing is the expectations amongst both shareholders, but now in particular a wider group of stakeholders. Those expectations are lifting. So not only do we want economic performance, but we want you to do the right thing socially, and we want you to do the right thing environmentally. Mm-hmm. And that's raising the bar, so to speak. And the last similarity is the complexity that comes from those first two, right? And so the demands on directors from a compliance perspective are growing as well, because every time we have a mistake, the tendency is we'll build more rules, yes, which takes you away from performance because you've got more to make sure you're compliant with.
Yes.
And that's fine. But from a board perspective, we're there to drive performance in concert with the law, so the 7 duties, in concert if we're listed with the listing rules, and it's very easy to default back to compliance.
Yes.
Now, just because you do all the right things doesn't guarantee high performance, and we see that locally with Fletcher Building, we see it globally with Carillion, and a few years ago Volkswagen and FIFA and many others beside. So the similarity is there's a lot going on. It's almost like chasing a camouflaged moving object behind a camouflage screen, blindfolded. That's what it feels like some days, and that's the game we play.
Yes.
And so as directors around the world, we need to be prepared to be alert, engaged, have this sense of purpose, and try to do the right thing.
Peter, that was astounding. Thank you very much for your time. I really enjoyed that conversation. I'm looking forward to having another conversation soon, because there's so many topics I would love to dig into your brain about. But I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Thank you very much for joining us, and I'll look forward to seeing you next episode. Thank you for watching this episode of Governance Bites. We have more episodes on YouTube and your favourite podcast channel, where I interview directors and experts on various topics relating to boards of directors and governance. We'd love to see you back, and please like, subscribe, and share the videos and podcasts.